Reese Lavelle stepped through the sliding glass doors of Valeon Tech at 8:09 a.m., her chest still tight from what she'd just witnessed. The sirens were still echoing in her head, the blur of a cyclist on the pavement, the sharp voice of the 911 dispatcher, the trembling hands of the woman who had screamed for help. Reese had stayed. She always stayed. That's just who she was. She barely had time to brush her wind-blown hair from her face before she saw him, Derek Lavelle, CEO of the company and the man who used to be her husband. He was waiting in front of the elevator, flanked by Valeon's head of HR. He didn't even pretend to be surprised. "You're late," he said flatly, as if announcing a broken printer. "It was an accident," Reese replied quickly, still catching her breath. "A cyclist got hit. 2 cars ahead. I called for help. Stayed until EMTs arrived." Derek cut her off with a raised hand. "This isn't about today. It's about a pattern." She blinked. "A pattern? You've been arriving later and later. It's not sustainable. Effective immediately. You're terminated." He motioned toward the HR rep, who was already holding a beige envelope. Reese stared at him. The words didn't land at first. "I've logged 75 hours a week for 5 months straight," she said quietly. "I haven't taken a day off since Christmas." "That's your choice," Derek replied. "This company runs on structure." She opened the envelope. It was all there. Printed, signed, dated. Yesterday. That's when it hit her. This wasn't a response to being 9 minutes late. It was a plan. A premeditated exit. They'd just been waiting for the smallest misstep. Her throat tightened, but she didn't let her voice crack. "I see," she said. He nodded, clearly expecting protest, emotion, some kind of scene. But there was nothing. Reese looked down at the paper again, then folded it carefully and placed it back into the envelope. She didn't look at Derek again. She just turned, walked toward the elevator, and pressed the down button. No one followed her, no one said a word. But as the doors closed behind her, a single thought sharpened in her mind. They were ready for this. They thought she wouldn't be. They were wrong. Reese didn't go home after she was fired. She couldn't. Her apartment was too quiet, too sharp with echoes of things she didn't want to feel yet. Instead, she drove aimlessly around the edge of the city, letting the late morning light filter across the dashboard as her thoughts rewound themselves. It wasn't just about being let go. It was about how easily it had happened, how rehearsed it felt. Valeon hadn't always been like that. There was a time, 4 years ago, when it had felt like home, like something she and Derek were building, brick by algorithmic brick. Back then, before the suits and scripted press releases, Valeon was just a concept, a lean team of 9 people working out of a cramped warehouse space with terrible Wi-Fi and too much caffeine. Reese had been the one to propose the core architecture for what would become Valeon's flagship product, a dynamic load-balancing algorithm that optimized clean energy distribution across large grids. She'd written the first lines of code at 2:30 a.m., after waking from a dream where highway lanes shifted based on traffic flow. She remembered sitting on the floor with her laptop, Derek asleep on the couch behind her, mumbling something about come back to bed. But she couldn't. Her mind had lit up, and the system began to form. 3 weeks later, when they presented the demo at a government-backed Green Tech Expo in San Francisco, the entire network failed mid-pitch. Screens froze. Metrics disappeared. Panic spread like fire across the booth. Derek froze. The sales lead nearly cried, but Reese had stepped forward, unzipped her laptop bag, and rewrote the missing load index manually in real time. Within 7 minutes, the system was running again. The demo not only recovered, it ended in a standing ovation. Valeon signed its first major contract the next day. That night, over cheap champagne and pizza in their hotel room. Derek had taken her hand and said, "You saved us. You always do." So when he later convinced her not to put her name on the patent filing, "We'll both benefit anyway," He'd said, she'd agreed, because back then, she still believed they were building something together. Now, 4 years later, she realized how expertly he'd made her invisible. She pulled into a grocery store parking lot and sat motionless for a long while. She didn't cry. She wasn't sure if she was still capable of that kind of release. Instead, she opened the Notes app on her phone and scrolled to a private folder labeled Foundations. Inside were backup drafts, dates, timestamps, everything she'd ever written for the Valion system, archived quietly, without anyone ever asking. And then she remembered something else, something that made her stomach drop: the loan. In early 2020, Valion had been bleeding capital. Investors were nervous. A critical expansion round fell through just days before payroll. Reese had still been married to Derek then. The banks weren't willing to extend a credit line. Valion was too young, too risky. So Derek had asked her, quietly, urgently, to co-sign a personal guarantee for a $48 million bridge loan. She had agreed without hesitation. At the time, it felt like the right thing. They were partners. She had access to equity, savings, her inheritance from her father. It was just paperwork. But now, her breath caught. She had never revoked the guarantee. Legally, that meant she was still the personal guarantor. Her name was still tied to Valion's largest foundational loan, still anchoring their access to operational capital. She pulled up her email and searched for the contract. There it was, digitally signed, still in effect. And as far as she knew, Derek had never told anyone. She stared at the screen for a long time. The feeling that crept into her chest wasn't satisfaction. It was a hollow, quiet chill, like someone walking through a house they once loved, now gutted and gray. They had built something together, but now only one of them was holding the beams up, and the other had just set fire to the roof. The elevator doors opened to the Valion lobby, and Reese stepped out into the soft hush of morning light filtered through frosted glass. No one looked up. No one said a word. She walked past the receptionist. New girl. Probably didn't even know who Reese was. Past the display screen that still featured her old project under the title Derek Lavell's Predictive Grid Revolution, Reese kept walking. There was no farewell email, no company-wide announcement, no awkward clapping in the hallway, just silence. She had given nearly 5 years of her life to this place, 75 hours a week. Holidays blurred into Slack messages, milestones achieved behind the curtain while others took the stage. And now, she was walking out the door like a temp who'd lasted 3 days. She didn't stop at her desk. She didn't want to see it stripped. She didn't want to feel the echo of a life that had been swept clean in a single sentence from a man who once kissed her forehead before every pitch. Instead, she made her way to the exit, one foot in front of the other, barely noticing the familiar scent of burnt espresso from the break room or the sound of muffled typing in conference room C. They were carrying on, just like that. No one followed her, except, maybe, Lana. Reese glanced sideways as she passed the third-floor staircase. Her former teammate, once her closest friend in the company, was standing there. For a moment, Reese thought she might step forward, say something, anything, but Lana looked away, just turned her head and stared down at her tablet like Reese wasn't even there. The floor beneath Reese's feet felt oddly uneven, like the hallway was tilted slightly, slanted against her. She kept walking, not trusting herself to stop. Outside, the Seattle sky was a dull sheet of gray, indifferent to what had just happened. The wind pressed against her coat like a reminder that she was no longer protected, no longer inside. It wasn't until she reached her car, hands trembling on the door handle, that she noticed it, a folded square of paper, stuck in the lining of her jacket pocket. She didn't remember putting anything there. She unfolded it slowly, her fingers stiff from cold and tension. Just 5 words, handwritten in soft, looping ink. "We saw it. You deserve better. She blinked at the words, reading them again. There was no name, no signature, but someone had noticed. Someone in that building still had eyes and conscience and courage, just enough to slip her this sliver of acknowledgement. She sat in the car for a long while, the note in her lap, not quite knowing whether to cry or feel comforted. Instead, she felt something stranger, unmoored, like she had stepped off a dock and the ground beneath her was now water. Hours passed in fragments. She drove without a destination, letting the hum of tires and traffic fill the silence Derek had left. By 4:15 p.m., she pulled into the back lot of an old co-working space she used to visit when Valion was still a hopeful idea. The building was half abandoned now, windows dusty, neon sign flickering weakly, but the Wi-Fi still worked. She sat at a corner table and opened her laptop. No Slack, no Teams, just her personal inbox. Flickering quietly, a new message blinked in. Subject: Thank you. The name stopped her. Jamie R., software intern, summer 22. Reese clicked it open. Hi Reese, I don't know if you remember me. I was the intern who couldn't figure out the back-end handoffs last summer. You stayed late with me 2 nights in a row until I finally got it. I'll never forget that. I also remember how you stood up for me when one of the senior devs mocked my stutter in the open channel. You didn't make it a scene, you just told him to knock it off. And suddenly, it stopped. I was too scared to thank you then, but I'm not now. Whatever they did to you today, they were wrong. You made people feel safe, and I hope someone makes you feel that way again soon. Jamie. Reese stared at the screen, the air still around her. It was such a small thing, but it cracked something open. Maybe she had been invisible, but not forgotten. And maybe not entirely alone. By 7:22 a.m., Reese sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by half-open laptops, scattered notebooks, and printed project timelines. The curtains were still drawn. She hadn't slept. Sleep wasn't useful right now. She was digging for a pattern, not a theory. She didn't have the energy for paranoia, just facts. Concrete shifts that might explain why everything at Valion had felt increasingly foreign over the last few months. Why her team felt distant. Why even Lana had stopped sharing updates after meetings. She opened the archived project boards from 6 months ago, versions stored in her private backups from when she used to run system architecture. She traced through the approval logs, personnel assignments, and weekly code reviews. That's when the discomfort began to bloom. Quiet at first, then sharper. Names she trusted, people who'd worked beside her from the beginning, were gone. Reassigned. Or worse, replaced. Mila, who had written the core stabilization script, reassigned to a dummy documentation task 2 months ago. Greg, the latency specialist, quietly removed from the test environment. No announcements, no promotions. They just disappeared from her orbit. And in their place, people Reese barely knew, fresh hires from consulting firms Derek had ties to, team leads who suddenly had the authority to override her push requests. It was all subtle, incremental, like watching a wall being built around her, one quiet brick at a time. She stood up too fast and had to steady herself. It wasn't incompetence, it was strategy. She pulled up the metadata from her last 3 code submissions. 2 had been delayed in deployment without explanation. 1 had been edited post-approval. When she clicked into the version history, her heart slowed. Derek's executive override tag was on it. Her breathing went shallow, not from shock, but from something deeper. A rage that hadn't found air until now. All those late nights, all those hours defending the system from breakdowns, covering for junior devs, writing silent documentation for bugs that weren't even hers, while Derek was behind the curtain, removing her voice from her own architecture. She clenched her jaw until it hurt. Then she opened a hidden folder she hadn't touched since the divorce. Legal and internal. It held backup emails from when she still had full admin access to Valion's communications database. Most of it was benign: project reminders, travel itineraries, budget reports. But then she saw it. An email dated 2 months ago. Subject line: "When she slips, be ready." Her pulse kicked hard. It was from Derek, sent to Claire Montgomery, the head of HR. The message was short, chilling in its efficiency. "I want to be proactive. She's nearing burnout. Give me the necessary documentation template so we can move immediately when something slips. Let's avoid another Q4 delay." No emotion, no concern. Just planning. Her stomach turned. So it wasn't about being late. It was never about a cyclist or a 9-minute delay. He'd been watching the clock, not for time, but for excuses. He didn't wait for failure. He engineered the perception of it. Reese sat back down slowly, eyes fixed on the screen. Something in her shifted. Not grief, not yet, but anger, cold and still, like glacial water pressing against a dam. She closed the laptop without shutting it down and sat in silence for several minutes. Then she whispered aloud, "So you've been waiting?" She looked at the wall opposite her, the one where Valion's first prototype diagram still hung in a frame. A gift from Derek, back when they believed they were partners. Her hands curled into fists in her lap. He replaced her team. He silenced her code. And now, he'd erased her entirely, or thought he had. She looked back at the laptop. He was careful, but he wasn't the only one keeping records, and she had just found her line in the sand. The silence in Reese's apartment felt different now, not empty, awake, like something had finally stirred in the quiet corners she'd been too heartbroken to look into. It was 9:30 a.m. when she opened the filing cabinet in the corner of her closet. A battered gray box sat behind her winter boots, unopened for almost 2 years. She slid it out, fingers steady, and flipped the latches. Inside, tax forms, early incorporation docs, printed Slack logs from a heated funding debate in 2019, and near the bottom, a slim black folder labeled Valion, Bridge Loan 2020. She pulled it out and laid it flat across her kitchen table. She hadn't thought about that loan in a long time. Back then, Valion had been 3 weeks away from collapse, burn rate through the roof, contracts delayed, payroll in limbo. Derek had been spiraling. They'd both been sleeping at the office. And the banks? Unmoved. Too early stage, too volatile, until Derek turned to her. "Just co-sign," he'd said. "It's procedural. We'll refinance in 6 months anyway." Reese hadn't hesitated. She'd had savings, equity, inheritance from her father. She believed in the product, in Derek, in the company they'd built together. Now, she began flipping through the document. Her eyes moved line by line, absorbing the language with sharpened clarity. The loan agreement was still intact. The terms hadn't changed. And then she saw it. On page 5. Personal guarantor, Reese A. Lavelle. No expiration, no revocation clause, no update of ownership status post-divorce. She sat back in her chair, slowly. Her name was still binding. Legally, she was the personal backstop to Valion's largest and most critical loan. And by the wording of the agreement, if she withdrew her guarantee, the bank had the right to immediately place the entire loan under review. She opened a browser tab and logged into the digital client portal. The account was still active. She clicked into the document history. No updates, no replacements, no notification of change in financial liability. She whispered it aloud, just to hear how it sounded. They never updated the bank after the divorce, which meant one thing. Valion had been running its finances, its payroll, its vendor contracts, its software licensing, on a loan personally tethered to someone they had just fired, someone they had tried to erase. She stared at the screen, her breath slow and even now. The fog of pain, betrayal, and fatigue was gone, cleared out by something sharper, something cooler. Not revenge, not yet, just knowledge. and knowledge, when placed in the right hands, had gravity. She clicked into the contract terms again. Section 9.2. Withdrawal Clause. See, in the event that the guarantor initiates a written request for withdrawal and the financial institution determines a material change in the company's financial status or ownership structure, the bank may execute a temporary operational hold for 72 hours to complete reevaluation. 72 hours. That was all it would take. 3 business days of frozen accounts, missed payments, delayed shipments, suspended access to software tools, public disclosures required by SEC protocols. And it wouldn't be illegal. It would be administrative. She pushed her chair back and stood. Not only had Derek discarded her, but he'd been arrogant enough to assume she'd disappear without looking back. He hadn't just underestimated her, he'd forgotten her entirely. And that was his first real mistake. She looked across the room at the whiteboard she hadn't touched since her departure. The markers were dry. The sketches faded, but the line at the top was still legible. Redundancy is a luxury, not a strategy. She hadn't thought of that phrase in years. She'd written it when Valeon lost its first beta client. Back then, she was trying to remind Derek to design for worst-case scenarios. Now, she was the worst-case scenario, and he hadn't designed for her. She opened her email and drafted a blank message. To bridgefinance@unioncapital.com. Subject: Re. Account 3824. Withdrawal of personal guarantee. She didn't hit send, not yet. But her finger hovered over the trackpad like it already knew the weight it carried. Reese didn't smile. She didn't need to. She was finally awake. Reese arrived early. The cafe was tucked into the corner of a converted textile mill. All exposed brick and mismatched chairs. The kind of place you only knew about if you'd been burned out by too many venture pitches and glossy decks. She ordered a coffee, black, no room, and took the seat furthest from the window. Instinct. Maybe. Or just habit after the week she'd had. She didn't expect Evelyn to show up on time. She never did. But when the tall woman stepped in at 10:05 a.m., wrapped in a cream blazer and confidence that didn't need to be loud, Reese's posture shifted, just slightly. Still allergic to sugar, I see, Evelyn said with a wry smile, nodding at Reese's plain coffee. Reese allowed herself the smallest smile back. Still allergic to pretense? Evelyn slid into the seat across from her. No handshake, no small talk, just 2 women with too much shared history and not enough time. I heard what happened, Evelyn said quietly. About the 9 minutes. Reese looked away. It wasn't about the 9 minutes, she said. I know. They sat in silence for a beat. The espresso machine hissed behind them like punctuation. Evelyn had once been Valeon's most promising early investor, until she pulled out just before Series B, citing strategic misalignment. Reese had assumed at the time it was a polite way of saying, I don't believe in this anymore. But now, she wasn't so sure. You saw it back then, didn't you? Reese finally asked. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. I saw him. That was enough. Reese exhaled, slow and quiet. She hadn't come here to complain or vent. She'd come to confirm something, anything, that she wasn't imagining the pieces she'd uncovered, that someone else could see the cracks too. You didn't just reach out because you heard what happened, Reese said. Why now? Evelyn met her eyes. Because the board is tired. Reese blinked. The board? I'm on it now, Evelyn said, calm as glass. Independent seat, appointed 6 months ago after 2 rounds of underperformance. Derek didn't object, but he wasn't thrilled. Of course he wasn't. He'd never liked strong voices he couldn't control. And now? Reese asked. Evelyn leaned forward. Now, you're in a very unique position. You've seen what he's done. You know what he's standing on, and how shaky it is. You have access he forgot about, and if you make your move, I'm prepared to back you. Reese stared at her. Back me? How? With influence, legal positioning, quiet votes. You don't need a scandal. You need pressure, applied precisely, strategically. Enough to make the cracks visible to the right eyes. Reese shook her head slightly, still catching up. You're asking me to bring him down. No, Evelyn said. I'm telling you, he's already falling. I'm offering you the chance to make sure he doesn't land on top of anyone else. A pause. And maybe, she added, to remind the board who built the foundation in the first place. Reese sat back in her chair, the weight of Evelyn's words settling into her like slow dawn light. She hadn't dared imagine this. Support. Leverage. A way back in that didn't involve lawsuits or shouting matches. Just carefully timed decisions. Truth laid bare with precision. I'm not interested in revenge, she said after a long moment. Good, Evelyn replied. Because this isn't about revenge. It's about restoration. Power that was taken without acknowledgement deserves to return with full credit. Reese looked down at her coffee, cold now but steady in her hands. And timing? She asked. How soon? Evelyn smiled. Timing, she said. Is everything. She reached into her bag and slid across a sealed envelope. Inside, she said, is a copy of the next board meeting agenda. Your name's not on it, yet. Reese didn't touch the envelope, not yet. But something in her chest softened. Not relief, not triumph, just the quiet warmth of being seen again. As Evelyn rose to leave, she paused at the table. Impeccable timing, she said, is justice. And then she walked out. Reese stayed in her chair a while longer. Envelope untouched, heart quietly beating against a door that had just creaked open. By 6:40 a.m., the city was still half asleep. Seattle's skyline glimmered behind low mist, and Reese Lavelle sat at her kitchen table, back straight, coffee untouched. The envelope Evelyn had handed her the day before was still sealed, resting at the edge of the table like a dare. But her laptop screen held her full attention. The cursor blinked in the email draft window. No long explanation, no flourish. Just a single, precise message. Subject: Withdrawal of personal guarantee. Account 3824. 2. Bridge Finance at unioncapital.com. Please be advised that I, Reese A. Lavelle, am formally withdrawing my personal guarantee associated with the above account, per the terms of Section 9.2 of the original agreement, dated March 17, 2020. Sincerely, Reese A. Lavelle. She hovered over the send button, not out of hesitation, but ritual. Once she clicked, there would be no turning back. But that was the point. At 6:41 a.m., she pressed send. And that was it. No sirens, no dramatic music, just the quiet hum of her refrigerator and the click of the laptop fan. Reese closed the lid. She went about her day with deliberate calm. Laundry, groceries, a run through Discovery Park. She didn't check her inbox again until 12:40 p.m. The reply from Union Capital was already waiting. Subject: RE. Withdrawal of personal guarantee. Account 3824. Ms. Lavelle. We acknowledge receipt of your withdrawal request. Per our obligation under the lending agreement, we have placed the account under 72-hour financial hold, pending reassessment of collateral and risk exposure. Operational disbursements from Valion Technologies have been suspended until further review. Regards, Jessica Penn. Senior Risk Officer Reese stared at the email, reading it once. Then again. It was done. The financial heart of Valion had just skipped a beat. She could already imagine what that meant. Payments paused. Vendor invoices frozen. Payroll likely queued but locked. Even internal systems might lag, especially those tied to expense authorization or third-party services. She didn't need to speculate long. At 1:13 p.m., her phone rang. Blocked number. She didn't answer. Seconds later, her inbox pinged. An email. From Claire Montgomery. Subject: Urgent. Call request. Financial Access Reese. I'm reaching out as counsel on behalf of Valion Technologies. We need to speak with you immediately regarding your recent communication with Union Capital. Do you understand the magnitude of what you've done? Please call me today. This affects hundreds of people. Claire Reese exhaled through her nose, slow, controlled. Do you understand the magnitude? The question rang with irony. Of course she understood. She had spent years propping up that magnitude, quietly fixing what others broke, quietly building what others claimed, quietly holding up a company that had now tried to pretend she never existed. This wasn't revenge. This was removal. Her removal. From the foundation. She walked over to her balcony and stepped outside. The air was crisp. Below, a delivery van rumbled through the intersection, unaware of the tectonic shift that had just begun 4 stories above. Reese didn't respond to Claire's email. Not yet. She returned to the kitchen, poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, and sat back down at the table. The same place she'd sat that morning when everything was still theory. Now it was reality. By the end of the day, Derek would know. He'd check the system. He'd call the bank. He'd scramble for answers. And maybe, just maybe, he'd realize the structure he thought was his had always depended on one name he no longer respected. Reese Lavelle. She took a sip of coffee, the bitterness steadying her. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to shout. She had already spoken, and the system was listening. By 10:03 a.m. the next morning, the cracks had become visible. Valion's internal payroll system failed its auto-run. Vendor invoices bounced back with red flags from the bank. The international contracts team sent urgent Slack messages to finance, wondering why disbursements weren't processing for a renewable grid project in Singapore. At first, people assumed it was a glitch. Then they realized no one had access to override the block. By noon, Derek was storming across the 14th floor, barking into his phone. The conference room blinds rattling each time he passed. Several mid-level managers tried to act like nothing was wrong, but the atmosphere shifted, eyes darted, chats flew under the radar. Everyone felt it, the slow exhale of something they didn't understand, but instinctively knew wasn't just technical. And then the software started to break. Small errors at first. One of the data dashboards in the ops center refused to load. The energy allocation map blinked intermittently, misreporting output by entire megawatts. Then came the real problem. The logic tree behind the predictive modeling crashed completely. The heart of the Valion system, written almost entirely by Reese Lavelle, was failing, and no one left at the company knew how to fix it. The internal license that ran the software's backend, a limited access registry Reese had built years ago, had been tied, via protocol, to an active personal guarantee clause. No one ever thought to update it after the funding round stabilized. After all, Reese had never left. Until now. At 2:40 p.m., an error message appeared across every dashboard running the prediction engine. License verification failed. Admin reauthorization required. Panic began to set in. Because the admin, the real one, she no longer worked there. Reese was at her dining table, phone face down, trying to avoid the flood of notifications. She had expected tension, expected blowback, but even she hadn't predicted how fast the system would unravel. Her laptop chimed. A message. From Malik N., Infrastructure Team, subject. Is this what I think it is? Attached. A screenshot of the central dashboard, frozen in gray, across the top. Someone had typed in all caps, "Only you knew how to restart this." Reese stared at it. Malik had always been respectful, but never chatty. They'd worked side by side for 2 years. He was sharp, technical, and smart enough to know when something had gone beyond recovery. There was no tone in the email, no accusation, no plea, just a statement of fact. Only she knew how to bring it back. And now, she didn't owe them that. She set the laptop aside and stood up, walking to the window. Outside, the street buzzed with life, people getting lunch, couriers zipping by, cyclists braving traffic. Normalcy. Meanwhile, inside Valion, everything they'd built was short-circuiting under the weight of one unchecked assumption: that Reese would always be there to catch the fall. Not this time. They hadn't just fired her. They'd erased her contributions, ignored her name on every system architecture draft, left her out of the press releases, cut her off like she'd never been critical. Now, those decisions had a price. Payroll delays meant missed deadlines. Missed deadlines triggered contractual penalties. And for a company teetering on its next round of investor funding, even a 3-day stall could look like a structural collapse. She walked back to the table and picked up her phone, scrolling through unread texts and emails from anonymous contacts, legal names she recognized from Valion's finance team, and even Derek's assistant. But one text stood out. Lana, her former teammate, the one who hadn't looked up when Reese walked out. Reese, I think he's finally scared. Reese didn't reply. Not yet. Because fear wasn't the goal. Understanding was. Consequences weren't about pain. They were about memory. And this time, the memory wouldn't fade quietly. This was what accountability looked like. Not in rage, not in public, but in the system that refused to run without her. The voicemails began just after 8:15 a.m. Reese watched the calls come in from her kitchen, the screen lighting up with no caller ID again and again. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The first message was short, tense. Reese, it's Derek. I think we should talk. Can you call me back? The second came 40 minutes later, more rushed. We're having some temporary issues, nothing serious. But I think your insight could really help stabilize things. Let's set something up. By the third, he'd dropped the corporate polish. I know you're upset. I get it. But this is bigger than both of us now. People's jobs are on the line. You don't want to be responsible for that, do you? And the fourth? Panic, barely contained. The board is calling a closed session. I need you to meet me. Just us. No pressure. Just, please, talk to me. Reese played each voicemail once, expression unreadable, then deleted them, one by one. There was no anger in her eyes, no satisfaction that spilled into gloating, only a calm that came from knowing exactly what she'd done and why. She brewed coffee slowly, grounding each motion with intention. Grind, tamp, pour, wait. She had spent years moving fast, fixing what others broke before they even saw the cracks. Now, for once, she was letting the cracks stay visible, letting them widen. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and sifted through emails, scrolling past Derek's assistant's increasingly frantic subject lines until she saw the one that mattered. From Evelyn Reed. Subject, confidential, special session invitation. Reese. The board has scheduled an emergency strategy session for Thursday at 3:00 p.m. Several members have requested your insight regarding current operational disruption and potential system stabilization pathways. You are invited to attend in an independent advisory capacity. Attendance is voluntary, but strongly encouraged. Let me know if you'll accept. Evelyn Reese read the message twice. Then, once more, just to let the shape of the moment sink in. They weren't just acknowledging her. They were asking for her. Not as an employee, not as someone tied to Derek, but as the expert, the creator, the one who could bring the system back, if she chose to. It would have been easy to revel in it, to picture Derek pacing in that sleek conference room, looking over his shoulder every time the door opened, to imagine the sudden shift in power dynamics. The same board that once nodded politely, while Derek took credit, now whispering her name behind closed doors. But Reese didn't lean into revenge. That wasn't her language. She answered with action, not anger. She hit reply. Evelyn, I'll be there. Then she closed the laptop. The wind outside had picked up. Leaves rustled against her balcony window, somewhere in the distance. The sound of construction echoed, a jackhammer tearing through old cement, making way for something new. She sipped her coffee and leaned back in her chair. The chaos behind Derek's voice hadn't shaken her. If anything, it had clarified things. He hadn't expected her silence to be this loud. He'd mistaken professionalism for weakness. And now? He was remembering who held the blueprint, who could navigate the labyrinth of code and licensing and back-end dependencies like the lines on her own palm. The woman he erased from the org chart was the one being invited back into the room, but not to clean up, to consult, on her own terms. And this time, the table would have only one name in bold print, Reese A. Lavelle. She set the mug down and let her eyes wander across the room, where the old prototype sketch still hung on the wall. A line of code at the bottom caught the light. She'd written it in a rush years ago, not knowing it would be the spine of a billion-dollar system. If the structure fails, return to root. And now, that's exactly what the company was doing, returning to her. The room was silent when Reese entered. She moved without rush, every step echoing softly off the glass and polished wood inside Valéon's executive boardroom. The long oval table gleamed beneath the overhead lights, water pitchers full, tablets charged, legal pads stacked at each seat. One chair remained empty, at the far end, facing the windows. It had no nameplate, but it was clearly meant for her. Reese slid into it without a word. She didn't look at Derek, not yet. Instead, she placed a single folder in front of her, unopened, and folded her hands over it, across from her. Derek sat stiffly, jaw locked, knuckles white around a pen he hadn't used. His tie was slightly off-center. Sweat shined faintly at his temple. He hadn't expected this moment to come, not like this. Not with her sitting across from him again, calm and unreadable. Evelyn opened the session. As you're all aware, she began, we've convened to address the ongoing operational freeze triggered by the withdrawal of a personal guarantee tied to account 3824. We've also requested the presence of Ms. Reese Lavelle, former systems architect and co-author of the original Valéon platform, who has agreed to consult as an independent advisor. Several heads turned to Reese. She gave a small, professional nod. No more, no less. The CFO began reading off impact numbers, delayed payments, flagged contracts, a near loss of 3 international clients, saved only by emergency intervention. Then came the tech lead, an unfamiliar face, describing the system's backbone dependency on legacy code and how no one currently on staff could decipher it fully. Finally, Evelyn turned toward Derek. Would you care to explain? She asked evenly. Why no contingency was developed for the foundational architecture? Why access remained linked to a personal guarantor no longer under contract? Why the licensing structure, written by your former lead architect, was never restructured after her departure? Derek shifted in his chair. He stopped, glanced at Reese, then tried again. We didn't anticipate she'd take action that would compromise the company. There was a pause. Then Evelyn leaned in slightly. Is it your position that Reese Lavelle is responsible for this instability? I'm saying, Derek snapped, louder than necessary, that she's using leverage in a way that puts us all at risk. You removed her, Evelyn said calmly. After 15 consecutive quarters of uptime and delivery, without redundancy, without legal cleanup, And now you're telling us this is her fault? The silence after that was colder than anything Reese had heard in months. A board member cleared his throat. I believe a motion is on the table. Reese didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply watched as the board members raised their hands. One by one. 8, 9, 10. Unanimous. Effective immediately, Evelyn said. Derek Lavelle will step down as CEO. Interim control will be transferred to the board until further restructuring is finalized. Derek stood slowly, eyes glassy, mouth parted in disbelief. He looked at Reese for the first time, searching for something, pity, rage, recognition. She gave him nothing, not a word, not a nod, not even a breath. Just silence, the kind of silence that fills a room with gravity. He walked out alone. The boardroom was quieter now. The weight of Derek's exit still lingered in the air, like the faint scent of smoke after a storm. Chairs shifted, laptops clicked closed. No one said it aloud, but the room was already rearranging itself around a new center. Reese. She remained seated, posture still, hands resting on the closed folder in front of her. She hadn't spoken since the vote. She didn't need to. Evelyn stood and moved to the whiteboard, uncapping a marker with a quiet authority that felt more intentional now. We need a reset, she said. Not just an operational fix, but a cultural one. The system held because one person built it with care and integrity, and it failed the moment we treated that as disposable. She turned to Reese. We want you back, not as an employee, as lead consultant, overseeing the transition, stabilizing the platform, reorienting the next phase of innovation. Reese didn't answer right away. She folded her arms and looked at the whiteboard, its scattered notes, bullet points, percentages, a mess that could be cleaned, if guided right. I'll need full technical authority, she said calmly. No red tape, no approval loops from people who don't understand the system. You'll have it, Evelyn said without hesitation, and I choose my own team. Of course, Reese gave a single nod. Then yes. There was a pause. Not applause, just the quiet hum of a decision landing exactly where it belonged. The meeting dissolved into logistics. People filed out. Evelyn remained behind, gathering the last of her notes as Reese moved to leave. But before she reached the door, Evelyn spoke again, this time softer. There's one more thing. Reese turned. We've completed a private equity acquisition of Derek's remaining shares, Evelyn said. Our firm now holds the largest voting bloc. Reese blinked. He sold them? Didn't have a choice. You know how these clauses work when someone is forced out. Evelyn gave a faint smile. But it opened a door. She walked over and handed Reese a new folder. Thinner, sleeker. Inside, a proposal. A legal revision to Valion's intellectual property structure. Reese read the first page, then the second. She looked up, eyebrows raised. You're naming me co-founder? You wrote the system. You kept it running. You held it together when no one else could. And you were erased from the patent for reasons we both know had nothing to do with merit. Evelyn stepped back, letting the offer breathe. This isn't a favor, she said. It's a correction. Reese closed the folder carefully. For a long moment. She stood there, still, centered, and quiet. The woman who once walked out without a single word now stood inside a company that finally understood what she was worth. Not for what she sacrificed, but for what she built. And now, for what she would rebuild. On her terms. It was quiet inside the cafe. Just the low hum of morning chatter and the occasional hiss of milk steaming behind the counter. Reese sat by the window, her favorite corner table facing the street. The same seat she used to choose when Valion was just an idea on a sketch pad, when every line of code still felt like a question instead of an answer. Now, everything was still. She sipped her coffee slowly, no rush in her bones, no pressure riding her shoulders. Her phone lit up beside her plate. Valion announces full restructure under new tech leadership. Former CEO steps down as board installs new advisory panel, led by Reese Lavelle. She stared at the screen for a moment, then locked it without opening the article. She didn't need to read it. She'd already lived it. What mattered now wasn't the headline. It was the silence that followed. For the first time in a long while. There was nothing left she needed to prove. She reached for her notebook, the kind with real paper, and opened to a blank page. Not to write code, not to map disaster recovery strategies or defense against intellectual theft. Just to sketch. Doodle. Remember what it felt like to think for herself. That's when the second notification buzzed through. Subject: New venture proposal. Confidential, from Larkspur Capital Partners Reese. We've been following your work since Valion's turnaround and would like to propose a new partnership. We're assembling a next-generation sustainability tech firm and would like you to lead the founding team with full control. Equity proposal attached. 51% founder stake. Let's build something clean, real, and yours. Darla Monroe. Managing partner. Reese reread the percentage again. 51%. Not a seat at the table. The table. She leaned back. Eyes closed for a moment as the realization sank in. This wasn't just about getting back what had been taken. It was about choosing, for the first time, what she would give and to whom. It was never really about the 9 minutes. That was just the match. The fuel had been building for years. Every unnoticed overtime shift. Every uncredited line of code. Every silent win that someone else wore like a trophy. And now, she'd built something they couldn't unwrite. She smiled. Not broadly. Just enough for herself. He fired me for 9 minutes. But it cost him everything. What does Reese's story teach us? That your value doesn't disappear when someone fails to recognize it. That silence isn't weakness, it's strategy. That sometimes, the most powerful move isn't shouting, it's leaving. With your dignity, with your records, with your blueprint. And most importantly, that it's never too late to build something no one can take from you again. If Reese's journey resonated with you, if you've ever been overlooked, undervalued, or underestimated, this story is for you. Drop a comment below and share your own story of quiet strength. Share this video with someone who needs the reminder that they still hold the pen. Like if you believe silent power is the most underestimated force in the room. And don't forget to subscribe. We've got more true workplace justice stories coming your way. Because sometimes, all it takes is 9 minutes to change everything.